Blood-curdling facts you did not want to know. Up until 1974, it was illegal to appear in the streets of Chicago if you were ugly. The best way to torture someone and make it as painful as possible is to steam them alive. It takes longer to destroy their nerves, the sensation is hotter than boiling water, and your organs are cooked from the inside out. Kagura syndrome is a mental delusion where you believe that the people around you have been replaced by imposters. The movie The Hills Have Eyes is based on a Scottish group from the 16th century called the Bean Clan. And over the course of 25 years, they killed and ate over 1,000 people. Brains taste like ice cream. If you live in a major city, there is currently a nuclear weapon pointed at you as you're watching this video.
What are some of the creepiest items at museums? I'm gonna rank some, but they're gonna get worse as we go. So first up, we have this run-of-the-mill medieval plague doctor mask. This is probably from around the late 1600s and it's at a museum in Berlin. Next up, we have this horrifying collection of crab claws doing human things at the York Castle Museum. This was a Victorian era hobby, making little diagrams out of things that they just found around the house because it was so boring to be alive back then. This one made me feel a type of way. It's a sheep heart full of push pins which was used to break curses. It's likely from the early 1900s and it's at the Pitt Rivers Museum in the UK. This one doesn't look bad, but it's the only cursed one on the list. This is a children's toy that was found in the wall of a 155-year-old mansion during renovations. It's at the PEI Museum and Heritage Foundation, and multiple workers have seen it move on its own. I mean, that checks out. Just look at it. And coming in first place is this nightmare fuel. This is at the Natural Science Museum in Scotland, and I don't even think they know what it is. They say it's taxidermied, but I don't know what thing has been taxidermied to make this. Anyways, for more spooks and scares, check out the podcast.
They found this girl, right?
Where?
In our neighborhood. Down our main street.
Is she good?
No,
she's not.
She's dead. That's why this is very important. It's all on you right now.
That isn't my problem.
You were
You
the
were
last
the
one
last
with
one
her.
seen with her. So right now, it's facing you right now, son.
This is Aiden Fucci, a 14-year-old boy from Florida, being questioned by his parents at a police station in 2021. Aiden is being held and questioned under suspicion of murdering his 13-year-old classmate, Tristan Bailey, something he insists he had no part in. But to understand how police came to suspect Aiden was capable of murder, we must go back to the beginning. In the quiet town of St. John.
He died 8 years ago, but he never truly left. It was a simple car accident, a twist of fate on a patch of black ice. The man who hit him was rushing to the hospital. His wife was in labor. There was no blame, no anger, no vengeance in his ghostly heart. He was alone in the world, his family gone, friends lost, and at his funeral only his despised boss and the family who accidentally took his life were present. So he followed them home, drawn to the warmth of their love. He became a guardian to little Lily, rocking her crib when she couldn't sleep. And over time, Jack and Lori, the parents, sensed his presence, accepting him as part of their family. They honored him with candles and a place at their table. But now a threat looms. Lori's obsessive ex is at the door, rage in his eyes. The ghost feels a surge of power fueled by the years of offerings and love. The knife in a spectral hand is a strange sensation, a warmth against his cold existence, but he knows what he must do. Lori, Jack, and Lily are his family now. He will protect them no matter what. They won't join him in the afterlife, not yet.
Here are some disturbing crime facts to ruin your day, part 4. Number 1. On December 31st, 2000, 4 members of the Miyazawa family were found deceased in their own home. A broken window and various other evidence led detectives to believe that this incident was a robbery gone wrong. However, this case soon took a bizarre turn. After ending the lives of the 4 family members, the killer decided to stay in the house for up to 10 hours. During this period of time, he drank tea, used a computer, ate ice cream, took a nap, and even took a dump in the toilet without flushing. However, despite the huge amount of DNA and physical evidence, this killer was never caught, and this case remains one of Japan's biggest mysteries. Number 2, we have Durango Vargas, a homeless Venezuelan serial killer and cannibal who targeted passerbys at a park, attacking them with a makeshift spear. Most of his victims were men because he thinks that males tasted better, and avoided fat people because he believed them to have higher concentrations of cholesterol and was not good for his own body. Since he was homeless without a fridge, Vargas had to seek out new victims every few days. In a 2016 prison riot, he killed 2 other prisoners and served their remains to other inmates, because sharing is caring.
This former teacher made an unaliving pact with a student that she kidnapped and assaulted. This is Kara Dickey, and she was 34 years old when she assaulted a 14-year-old student of hers. Now, at the time of her arrest, Kara Dickey was a middle school teacher. She was married, she had kids of her own, but she somehow got involved with a 14-year-old student of hers. And quickly, the relationship between her and her student grew from platonic to extremely inappropriate. She was sending him inappropriate text messages, and at one point it began to get physical. And on the afternoon of June 16, 2008, she went to the kid's house, picked him up, supplied him with rum and various over-the-counter drugs, and then took him on a road trip visiting many locations around the Buffalo, New York area, all the while they were engaging in inappropriate behavior with each other, if you know what I mean. And in an even more disturbing twist, she actually made a pact with the child that she was abusing that they would both take their own lives if they were ever caught by the police. Obviously, this never happened because she was caught by the police, brought to trial, and she was convicted of the assault of a child. And she served a few years in prison for these charges, but she was released in 2014 and just 2 years later was back in prison because one day she said she was done with parole, she cut off her ankle monitor and went on the run. Now, obviously, the police eventually caught up with her again. She was sent back to prison, and then after her release in 2018, she violated the terms of her parole again and was sent back to prison. And this time, people thought that she may have been involved with another child. I don't know, people like this are dangerous, and this story goes to show that pedophiles aren't always men.
One of the cable channels we had in prison was the Discovery Channel, and every now and then they do these long marathons of true crime documentaries, just these absolutely horrible stories, what happened and where the person is now. I was never a big fan, but I clearly remember the day the guys started yelling out of their cells for everybody to turn on the Discovery Channel that Robert was on there. Because Robert was this young kid that everybody liked and figured had just gotten caught up in something. He had gone to a music conservatory, he'd come out of a terrible neighborhood, and yet he was playing violin with some of the best people on the East Coast. He was well-spoken and it seemed successful, and everybody just assumed he got drawn back into a neighborhood beef or something that happened with his family. But this true crime documentary told a very different story. Turns out Robert had had a crush on this girl in high school, and he was jaded because she was dating other people and would never date him, would never give him the time of day. So this guy, who up to this point everybody thought was just a nice guy who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, actually broke into her home and was going to force her to accept his advances. Except she fought back, and at 16 years old, he ended up taking this girl's life, all because he was jealous she was dating other people and wouldn't give him the attention he wanted. And after the show was over, everyone was stunned because it had shown him to be the opposite of what everybody thought. And he stayed in the cell the rest of that afternoon and the rest of that evening. He didn't come out the next day until it was time for chow. And I've never seen a bigger spectacle in prison where everybody's just staring at this one person. Like, you can hear a pin drop, and all anybody's wondering is, like, how is he going to respond to this? Like, who is this guy? And he stayed quiet, and he stayed to himself, and eventually everybody went back to doing what they were doing, but everybody looked at him differently. Everyone has done something impulsive or destructive at 16 years old, but this shocked even some of the more hardened guys.
Killer Couples Part 1. This is Bonnie and Clyde. You asked for it. Everyone knows about the very much in love and good-looking outlaws who were killed outside of Gibbsland, Louisiana on May 23, 1934. Trapped in their car as police unloaded 150 rounds, it ended a 21-month-long crime spree of robbing gas stations, restaurants, and local banks. But did you know that Bonnie and Clyde were actually serial killers? Yep. Even though they kept their heists pretty small, they were brutal and had a tendency to kill anyone who got in their way, mainly prison guards and police officers. Their murders were mainly done out of necessity and only when Clyde was cornered. He was more likely to kidnap a cop, hold him for a while, and then release him further down the line with money to head home. Towards the end, though, the second that he saw a police officer, they would shoot because they weren't sure whether there were traps being set for them. The couple never married because Bonnie still had a husband in jail, but they remained very much in love until the very end.
At first, you can see Katie taking items in and out of her storage unit, with her silver Kia minivan parked directly in front. They then see a younger male walk directly across his unit to Katie's unit. They start talking, and the conversation seems to last several minutes. Catherine continues to move items in and out of her storage unit while this unknown man watches her. At one point, you can even see him ducking behind her car so he cannot be seen from her line of view. All this is extremely odd behavior, and it only seems to get worse. Catherine then walks down to the main office that's located at the front of the building. The man peeks around the corner to see if the coast is clear. He then enters her storage unit and hides there, waiting for her to return. Minutes pass before Catherine comes back from the office and enters the storage unit. Immediately, the overhead door shuts.
There has been an absolutely horrific murder this week that was live streamed on Instagram. This case is extremely disturbing, so please be warned before watching. On Friday, 12,000 people watched a Bosnian bodybuilder kill his wife on Instagram Live. 35-year-old Nermin had been abusing his wife during their marriage, and the pair had a young child. On Friday morning, he took to Instagram Live to tell his followers that they could witness a live killing. Absolutely horrifically, he turns the camera to his ex, whose face is completely covered in blood and disfigured. He calls her a derogatory name and blames her for her own death because she reported him to police. Disturbingly, you can hear the child crying in the background. He then tells his followers that he's the child's father and his ex had hidden the toddler from him for over a week and reported him to police for DV. So, in my opinion, yes, she's taking steps to keep her and her child safe from you. After shooting his wife in the head on Instagram, he then goads his followers saying, "Someone come and save the child." A police chase then began and he went on a shooting rampage. He continued to film and tells his viewers that he's killed 2 other people who actually turned out to be an innocent man and his young son. He also wounded a police officer, another man and a woman while on the run. He ended up unaliving himself on the same day.
Probably the most haunting tale on this list. 2 boys, 16 and 17, vanished from their outback cattle station. The discovery of their bodies months later only deepened the mystery. James Annetts, 16, and Simon Amos, 17, separately answered ads in 1986 to work as jackaroos. The workplace or cattle station in question was Flora Valley Station, about 120 kilometers east of Halls Creek. The 2 boys were from city life and not accustomed to the harsh, remote conditions of the outback. When the boys arrived at Flora Station in West Australia, the cattle industry was in decline, and the station management had been cutting costs. Most of their tasks involved bore runs to check that windmills and other equipment were still functioning. But on the afternoon of Monday, December 1st, 1986, the 2 boys did not reply to their twice daily radio checkups. The station owner visited the house where the 2 boys were staying and found their Datsun ute missing. No one knows where they were headed or just where they were going. A 3-day aerial search of over 100,000 square kilometers failed to find anything. In April 1987, a bulldozer driver found the abandoned Datsun ute in the sand dunes about 500 kilometers southeast of Halls Creek. There were clear signs that the boys had tried to jump-start the car. An SOS had been formed on the vehicle's roof with spanners and an arrow made with 2 branches. Further investigations revealed the boys' remains. The pair walked about 18 kilometers and made a camp where Simon Amos was found with a gunshot wound in his head. James Annetts walked a further kilometer and died, but not before scratching a last note to his family into a water bottle.
We see him following at least 2 females before he mounts the attack on Zara. He follows a particular lady for a few streets, and he does get up behind her. There are other people around, and this is the worrying thing, he's not put off by this. She must become nervous around this, and she goes into a shop. The lady in question probably thinks he's now gone, she's done what she needed to do, she's diverted attention, and she can now come out. He is outside the shop, just further along the road. And he then comes into view, he's going to follow her again. He is making a genuine attempt to find her. He's looking round cars, he's looking down alleyways of houses and that, and then he gives up. The second lady, he gets closer to her, falls back, gets closer to her, and there's very few people around. But there's a couple of members of the public, and they're crossing the road, and they actually stop halfway in the road and turn and watch him. Don't know what's going through their mind, we didn't trace those people. The woman speeds up down this road, manages to divert away into an address. He then continues back into Cranbrook Road, where he had originally walked with this woman, and that's where he picks up Zara.
Move forward, darling. You can do it.
Step after step, he asks her to move towards him, until...
When I saw it with my own eyes, I thought, how can I deny it, you know?
What Gerald doesn't know at the time is that the woman in the wheelchair, who stood and walked among the crowd, was actually one of Jones' secretaries, hired for the spectacle.
My personal feelings with Jim Jones were always good ones. I always thought he was handsome. Just watching him, I would just be mesmerized.
Some people see a great deal of God in my body. They see Christ in me, a hope of glory.
But when I got old enough to realize the difference between good and bad, I noticed that all of the meetings weren't happy meetings.
Every Wednesday, Jim Jones offers a different kind of meeting to his followers. He calls them catharsis, the purging of evil.
If you got caught talking to people that were not affiliated with the church, then you would be in trouble for that.
Members, even children, could be called to the front and be hit repeatedly with a paddle, while the entire congregation is made to laugh at you.
I would find myself looking around at all the adults, thinking to myself, you can't think this is okay. You just can't. I was scared to do anything wrong because I was scared I was going to be called up and be beaten.
As the Parks family is getting ready to follow Jim Jones to Guyana, Tracy is deeply troubled.
I can't figure out for the life of me why my parents went when the red flags were here.
I want to give you more than I have. I want you to be greater than I am. And if you don't want to go this route, then go to hell where you want to, but don't bother me.
I remember landing in a little plane on the Port Kaituma airstrip that's not very far from Jonestown.
As Tracy gets off the plane with her family, the air is so thick and so hot, she can hardly breathe. The family now has to board a tractor to be taken to Jonestown.
When we came up on them gates, they were standing there with guns. And at that moment, I knew I had just entered the gates of hell.
I said, I feel like I'm making the biggest mistake of my life.
Right away, Tracy and her family are stripped from all of their belongings, including their passports. Then, Tracy is separated from her parents.
They told my parents right then and there, she's going to be staying in the kids' area and you guys are going to be going to your own cottage. I was devastated.
According to Jim Jones, family bonds are selfish. But the truth is, he wants to turn family members against one another. And the best way to do that is to isolate them. Already, Tracy's father Gerald knows he's made a mistake. The next morning, while walking around the grounds, Gerald runs into his own cousin.
And she said, how do you like Jonestown? I said, I don't.
CCTV watches as he takes the elevator downstairs, and he went to the mall opposite his hotel. Here he is seen purchasing a rather large suitcase. After taking it back to his apartment, he's seen leaving once more, and this time making his way to another nearby shop where he's seen purchasing cleaning supplies. A little while later, he's seen exiting the apartment building once again and getting into a taxi. CCTV shows him at a car rental office, picking up the keys to a vehicle he'd hired, and Jesse is captured driving it back to the City Life apartments. And then at around 4 p.m. that afternoon, incredibly, Jesse went on another Tinder date. This date didn't go as well as his date with Megan, and the lady actually got the creeps by him. She would later say that she felt uncomfortable with him, to the point that she didn't even want to walk with him to where his car was parked. She instead made up a story that her mom was waiting for her somewhere else. The turning point came when Jesse nonchalantly revealed that his friends were police officers searching for a buried body just outside Auckland, and that the scent would be untraceable if the body was buried deeper than 4 feet. This information sent shivers down her spine, confirming her gut feeling to distance herself from him. After the date, Jesse returned to the hotel where he borrowed a professional carpet cleaner and then took it back to his room. He'd apparently messed red wine on his carpet and wanted to clean it up. He's then seen loading 2 large suitcases onto a hotel trolley and taking it down to his rented vehicle. He put the bags in the trunk of the car and then returned to his room for the night. The following morning, Jesse was up bright and early and went to a nearby store to buy a shovel. He then got into the rented vehicle and seemed to go for a drive. He's spotted again about 2 hours later, this time at a local car wash, where he's seen giving the vehicle he'd just hired a meticulous cleaning, before returning back to his apartment. Over the next couple of days, Jesse is seen discarding various items in dumpsters all around Auckland. His behavior was strange indeed, and police decided to take a closer look at him. The cleaning products, the professional carpet cleaner, and the rental car all seemed to point at him trying to get rid of evidence, and police started fearing for the worst. So on December 5th, they called Jesse in for questioning.
How did the evening pan out?
Yeah, pretty good. So I thought, you know what, if I meet at Sky City, at least I know that there's lots of people around, so if it is someone that it's not, then I can just walk away.
How did the evening sort of come to an end?
There was a hug and a kiss on the cheek, and a thanks, nice meeting you. And then I said, let me know about tomorrow. And she said, okay, and then she kept walking.
This WWE wrestler murdered his wife and child before taking his life with an exercise machine. This is Chris Benoit. He was known as the Canadian Crippler and the Rabid Wolverine. And throughout his career in wrestling, he held 30 championship titles. He was one of the most well-respected people in the WWE, and so many people across the planet knew who he was at the time of his death. So these are Nancy and Daniel, Chris's wife and child. At around 3:30 p.m. on June 23, 2007, one of Chris's friends received a voicemail from Chris. In this voicemail, Chris told his friend that he wouldn't be appearing at the event that evening and that his wife and son had food poisoning and were feeling ill. When Chris's friend called him back, Chris sounded tired and groggy, and he basically repeated what he had said on the voicemail. By the way, Chris's friend that he was talking to was fellow wrestler Chavo Guerrero. So over the next 24 hours, Chris was still really hard to reach. Friends and family members of his were trying to get in contact with him and he wasn't responding. And he was supposed to be in Houston, Texas for a massive wrestling event that Sunday evening. So early on Sunday morning, the day of the wrestling event, a number of texts were sent from Chris and his wife's phones. 4 of the texts just contained his home address, and the other text stated that the dogs were in a safe area and that a side door of the house had been open. Now, Chris was supposed to be landing in Houston, Texas for that event that evening at around 8 a.m. that day. But when his friend went to go pick him up, Chris was nowhere to be found. Later that morning, Chris actually called the WWE's Talent Relations office and stated that his wife was at the hospital with him because their son was vomiting. He then stated that he'd be catching a later flight and he would still make it to the show in Houston that evening, but that never happened. And that would be because at the end of that day, Chris, his wife, and his son would all be dead. And Chris's wife, Nancy, and his son, Daniel, were already dead at the time that he was texting and calling his friends. So now let's go back a few days to Friday, June 22nd, 2007. So on that day, Chris snapped. He bound his wife, Nancy's feet together with duct tape, and he restrained the rest of her body with cables, and he had then shoved a tube sock and tape into her mouth as a makeshift gag. Apparently, Chris had bound his wife inside of the office space inside of their home, and after that he pressed his knee into her back and strangled her with a loose cord. And strangely, after he murdered his wife, he placed a Bible right next to her body and covered her body in a blanket. At some point after killing his wife, Chris then moved forward with the murder of his own son. After toxicology reports were finished after the murder, investigators found that Daniel had Xanax in his system. So it seems like Chris had sedated him before killing him. So on that day, Chris put his son to sleep and then strangled him to death in his own bed, and afterwards once again placed a Bible right next to his son's body. Now, investigators eventually found needle marks on Daniel's arms, and people have alleged in the years after the murders that Daniel was suffering from what's called Fragile X syndrome, which makes you naturally just a smaller child with a smaller frame. And according to some of Chris's friends and family, this syndrome had caused a lot of domestic issues within their marriage and had caused Chris to feel like his son was just too small. So after Chris had murdered his wife and son, that's when he placed those phone calls and those texts to his friends. He basically was saying his final goodbyes and setting everything in order. And Chris then went to a lat pull-down machine, a piece of exercise equipment, and created a noose out of a loose wire. He basically held up the weights and then wrapped this around his neck and released the weights, which ended up strangling him to death. So apparently during this time frame, Chris had been researching some religious things on his computer, including some texts about the prophet Elijah and the resurrection of a dead boy. I mean, there's still a lot of mystery and intrigue surrounding these crimes, like exactly why they happened and what the Bibles meant. But yeah, this is one of the most gruesome crimes to rock the WWE, and it's definitely one that will never be forgotten. Experts have stated, though, that they believe that the head trauma that Chris suffered while working as a wrestler and performing in these wrestling matches may have had something to do with all of this. And one researcher who actually examined Chris's brain after the murders and after he took his own life stated that his brain resembled that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer patient. Now, after everyone in the WWE learned that Chris Benoit and his family were dead, instead of having the live Raw wrestling match that they were going to premiere that night, they actually aired a 3-hour-long tribute to the life and work of Chris Benoit. This was a lot of people saying how amazing Chris was as a person, basically talking him up, and they didn't really know exactly what had happened at the time. But the next day, when they found out the details of how Chris and his family had died, the WWE quickly tried to distance themselves from the whole thing and stated that on the next broadcast, they wouldn't even be mentioning Chris's name other than the opening remarks where they addressed that maybe they shouldn't have aired this really fluffy memorial piece right away.
Have you heard of this kid named Riker Webb, bro? Bro, I just recently figured out about this story, and it's kind of unsettling, I ain't gonna lie. This kid, right, was playing outside with his dog. Normal day, he was 3 years old. His mom went to check on him, and he was gone. Kid was gone. Just like that, just disappeared. They get search parties, neighbors, everybody, the police, all them, they all looking for this boy everywhere, right? It even got so bad that they even got the National Guard looking for him. So like they got the whole city looking for this kid, right? Okay. 2 days later, they found him. Found him in the woods. This is the weird part. He was only gone for 2 days. Kid looks like a completely different kid, bro. This don't look like the same kid. It looked like he seen her. I don't know what he went through in them woods, bro. But this kid looked different. Like he done been through some shit, bro. Like look like he done been through a war or something. You know what I'm saying? But I'm gonna show you the picture, but you'll see it when you watch the video.